When a bitter family war erupted over an $80 million Connecticut estate, the youngest daughter walked away with nothing but a rotting, detached garage. Her siblings laughed at her foolishness, but the sneers stopped entirely when she broke through the concrete floor and uncovered a multi-million-dollar secret that defied history. The rain lashed aggressively against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Belmont and Associates, casting long, weeping shadows across the mahogany conference table. Inside the meticulously climate-controlled room, the atmosphere was suffocating. The Harrington family had gathered to carve up the empire of their late patriarch, Harrison Harrington, and the scent of greed was thick enough to choke on. At the head of the table sat attorney Gregory Belmont, a man who had spent 3 decades navigating the treacherous waters of generational wealth. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, looking uncomfortably at the 3 siblings seated before him. On his left was Preston Harrington. At 45, Preston was a ruthless commercial real estate developer whose tailored Italian suits barely concealed his predatory nature. He tapped a gold fountain pen impatiently against his leather folio, his jaw set in a hard, calculating line. Beside him sat Valerie Harrington Sutton, a 41-year-old socialite whose 3 spectacular divorces had been funded almost entirely by her father's bank accounts. She wore dark, designer sunglasses indoors, ostensibly in mourning, though she hadn't visited her father in the final 2 years of his life. Then, sitting at the far end of the table, isolating herself from the others, was Madeline. At 32, Madeline was the outlier of the Harrington bloodline. She wore a simple wool coat and possessed a quiet, pragmatic demeanor that infuriated her older siblings. While Preston and Valerie had spent their youth draining trust funds and demanding executive titles in Harrison's shipping and salvage conglomerate, Madeline had chosen a quiet life as an archivist and had been the only one to sit by Harrison's bedside as his lungs finally gave out. "If we could expedite this, Gregory," Preston snapped, dropping his pen. "I have a board meeting at 2 o'clock. We all know the broad strokes. The estate is valued at roughly $85 million, including liquid assets, the stock portfolios, and the Fairweather Manor property. Let's just get the paperwork signed." Attorney Belmont cleared his throat, his eyes darting down to the heavy parchment document in front of him. "Harrison was very specific in his final weeks, Preston. He amended this document just 10 days before his passing. I must read it exactly as instructed." Belmont began to read. The distribution started predictably. Valerie was awarded the entirety of the liquid cash accounts and the offshore trust funds, a sum totaling nearly $30 million. She offered a tight, victorious smirk, sliding her sunglasses down the bridge of her nose. Preston was handed the crown jewels, sole ownership of Harrington Logistics, the multinational shipping conglomerate, and the sprawling Fairweather Manor itself, a palatial 50-room estate overlooking the Long Island Sound. Madeline sat completely still, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't want the money. She had never wanted the money. But the complete omission of her name thus far stung, a harsh reminder of her father's legendary eccentricity and unpredictable nature. "And finally," Belmont said, his voice dropping half an octave, "to my youngest daughter, Madeline, who stood by me when the house grew quiet, I leave the following. Parcel 4B. The room fell dead silent. Even Preston stopped tapping his pen. "Parcel 4B, Valerie repeated, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Gregory, what on earth is Parcel 4B? "It is the detached eastern carriage house," Belmont read, carefully keeping his eyes on the paper. "And the immediate quarter-acre of land it sits upon. Furthermore, I leave Madeline the contents of said carriage house, in their entirety, free and clear of any estate tax or sibling interference." Preston let out a sharp, barking laugh. "The garage?" He left her the old garage. It was a dilapidated, corrugated steel and rotting wood structure sitting on the absolute furthest edge of the estate. It hadn't been used as an actual carriage house since the 1920s. For the last 40 years, it had been Harrison's personal junkyard, a place he retreated to, reeking of motor oil, decaying tarps, and rusted machinery. It was an eyesore that Preston had been begging his father to bulldoze for a decade. "There must be a mistake," Valerie said, though her voice betrayed a deep, malicious amusement. "Madeline gets the grease trap, and we split the 80 million. Is there a secondary trust fund for her?" "There is not," Belmont confirmed softly. He slid a sealed envelope across the table toward Madeline. "Your father asked me to give you this, Madeline, directly." Preston slammed his hand on the table. "This is absurd, but fine. Maddie, listen to me. That structure is a liability. It's structurally unsound and sits right on the edge of the property line I now own. I'll give you $20,000 for the deed right now. It saves you the property taxes and the demolition fees." Madeline ignored her brother. She picked up the envelope, broke the wax seal, and unfolded the single piece of heavy stationery. It was written in her father's shaky, late-stage handwriting. "Maddie, your brother sees the world in square footage, and your sister sees it in price tags. They are blind. Look beneath the grease, my girl. I left you the engine that runs it all. Do not sell." "Dad." Madeline slowly folded the letter and slipped it into her coat pocket. She looked up, her gaze steady, meeting Preston's predatory stare. "I'm keeping the garage, Preston," she said quietly. Preston sneered, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. "Suit yourself, Maddie. Have fun playing with rusted hubcaps. I'm giving you exactly 30 days to clear whatever garbage you want out of it before I build a 12-foot privacy wall separating your little dump from my estate." As her siblings swept out of the conference room, triumphant and bloated with their new fortunes, Madeline sat alone with the lawyer. Belmont looked at her with genuine pity. "Are you all right, Madeline?" he asked. "I'm fine, Gregory," she replied, standing up. "I need the keys to Parcel 4B. The Eastern carriage house was in worse condition than Madeline remembered. 2 days after the will reading, she pulled her modest sedan up to the edge of the property. The structure loomed beneath the canopy of ancient, weeping oak trees. Ivy had aggressively reclaimed the eastern wall, creeping through shattered window panes and twisting around the rusted iron gutters. The heavy wooden double doors, designed for 19th century horse-drawn carriages, were severely warped, secured only by a massive oxidized padlock. Madeline unlocked the padlock, wincing at the screech of metal on metal, and pushed the heavy doors open. The air inside was thick, smelling of mildew, ancient gasoline, and damp earth. Sunlight pierced through the holes in the roof, illuminating swirling vortexes of dust. The space was enormous, easily 2,000 square feet, but it was packed to the rafters with absolute junk. Stacks of rotting cardboard boxes, oxidized engine blocks, piles of dry rotted tires, and tarps covering unrecognizable mounds of debris filled the room. For the first time, a wave of profound doubt washed over her. Look beneath the grease. Was it a metaphor? Or had her father's mind truly slipped in his final days? Harrison Harrington had been a brilliant man, a titan of industry, who started by salvaging sunken cargo freighters in the 70s. But in his later years, he had grown intensely paranoid, cutting ties with banks and retreating into isolation. For 2 grueling weeks, Madeline worked alone. She bought heavy-duty contractor bags, rented a commercial dumpster, and began the brutal, back-breaking labor of clearing her inheritance. Her siblings did not make it easy. Preston sent surveyors to hammer bright orange property line stakes exactly 1 inch from the carriage house walls. Valerie texted her photos from a luxury resort in St. Bart's, offering backhanded pity about Madeline's little trash cleaning project. By the 14th day, her hands were blistered, her muscles ached, and the dumpster was full, yet she had found nothing of value. No hidden bank bonds in the glove compartments of rusted car chassis. No antique jewelry buried in the toolboxes. Just heavy, unrelenting junk. Exhausted, Madeline sat on an overturned milk crate in the center of the now empty room. The only thing left was the floor itself, a massive, continuous slab of poured concrete, stained black with decades of spilled oil. She pulled her father's letter from her pocket, tracing the ink with her thumb. Look beneath the grease. The engine that runs it all. Frustrated, she picked up a heavy cast-iron pipe wrench she had unearthed that morning and tossed it onto the ground. Clang! Madeline paused. The sound was wrong. Concrete is dense. When struck by heavy iron, it should produce a dull, flat thud. But the sound that had just echoed through the empty carriage house was distinct. It had a hollow, metallic reverberation to it. Her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs, Madeline stood up. She picked up the wrench and walked over to the spot where it had landed. A particularly dark, heavily oil-stained section of the floor near the back wall. She gripped the wrench with both hands and slammed it down like a hammer. Clang! The hollow vibration buzzed through the soles of her work boots. She moved 3 feet to the left and struck the floor again. Thud. Solid. She moved back to the stained area. Clang. Hollow. Madeline fell to her knees, using the edge of the wrench to furiously scrape away decades of hardened grease, dirt, and paint. As the thick layer of grime peeled back, the texture of the floor changed. It wasn't concrete. It was a massive plate of industrial steel, cunningly painted and textured to blend seamlessly with the surrounding floor slab. Tracing the perimeter, she found the edges. It was a rectangle, roughly 8 feet by 10 feet. And in the very center, recessed beneath a heavy iron flap she had to pry up with a crowbar, was a mechanism. It was a heavy rotary vault dial, forged from brass, sitting above a thick steel handle. Madeline stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. This wasn't a root cellar. This wasn't a maintenance pit. This was bank-grade security, buried beneath a ruined garage on the edge of a forgotten estate. She wiped the sweat from her forehead, staring at the brass dial. She needed a combination. Her father hadn't given her any numbers, no secret codes in the letter. She pulled the letter out again, reading it frantically. Look beneath the grease, my girl. I left you the engine that runs it all. Wait. Madeline scrambled to her feet and ran to the corner of the garage where she had stacked her father's old ledgers and paperwork from the 1970s, the only things she hadn't thrown away. She flipped through an old, leather-bound logbook from Harrington Salvage. Her father's very first commercial salvage vessel, the ship that had launched his entire empire, the literal engine of his fortune. She found the registration page. The vessel was named the Iron Maiden, and its maritime registration number was 41972. Madeline walked back to the steel plate. Her hands were shaking so violently, she had to steady them against her knees. She gripped the cold brass dial. Right to 41, left to 97, right to 2. A heavy internal metallic clack echoed from beneath the steel. Madeline gripped the recessed steel handle, braced her boots against the floor, and pulled with everything she had. For a moment, it resisted, but then hydraulic hisses pierced the silence. The massive 8x10 steel floor plate began to lift on its own, guided by hidden industrial pneumatic struts. A rush of cold, perfectly climate-controlled air blasted upward, smelling faintly of ozone and old paper. Madeline grabbed her heavy-duty flashlight, switched it on, and aimed the beam downward. A reinforced steel spiral staircase descended into absolute darkness, but the beam of her flashlight caught something at the bottom. It wasn't just a bunker. It was a subterranean cavern. The light reflected off rows of polished chrome, immaculate, curving fenders of cars that shouldn't exist outside of museums, and directly at the base of the stairs, stacked carelessly on a metal workbench, was a pyramid of dull, heavy yellow bricks. Solid gold. Madeline stepped onto the first rung of the staircase, descending into a secret that would rewrite the legacy of the Harrington family forever. Madeline descended the spiral staircase, the beam of her flashlight piercing the frigid, heavily filtered air. Her boots struck the steel grating with sharp, rhythmic clangs that echoed through the vast subterranean expanse. When her feet finally touched the smooth epoxy floor of the bunker, she fumbled along the concrete wall until her fingers brushed a heavy industrial breaker switch. She threw it. A sequential series of high-intensity fluorescent lamps flickered to life, snapping down the length of the cavernous room in blinding white succession. Madeline gasped, dropping her flashlight. The true scale of her father's secret empire was staggering. The underground facility stretched for at least 100 yards, extending far past the property line of the carriage house and tunneling directly beneath Preston's newly acquired manor. It was a museum of unparalleled automotive history, parked in precise diagonal rows. The vehicles were immaculately preserved under custom-fitted, climate-controlled preservation bubbles. Madeline walked toward the closest one, her hands trembling as she unzipped the transparent shroud. Beneath it sat a pristine silver 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SLR Uhlenhaut coupe. Only two were ever built, and the automotive world assumed the second was locked in a corporate vault in Stuttgart. Yet here it rested, buried beneath a rotting garage in Connecticut. It was an artifact worth at least $140 million entirely on its own. Next to it sat a dark blue 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO, its polished chrome bumpers reflecting the sterile overhead lights. There were 6 cars in total, representing a staggering accumulation of automotive royalty that defied all logical explanation. But the cars were merely the visual centerpiece of the room. Against the far northern wall, stacked with terrifying nonchalance upon heavy industrial steel shelving, were the yellow bricks she had seen. Madeline approached the shelving unit. The bricks were heavy, dull, and stamped with the distinct archaic hallmarks of the United States Assay Office from the 19th century. She picked one up. It weighed nearly 30 pounds. Behind the gold sat a row of reinforced maritime lockboxes. She pried one open to find it filled to the brim with incredibly rare, uncirculated double eagle gold coins, wrapped in deteriorating oilcloth. Her father had not simply hoarded wealth. He had hidden the legendary, supposedly lost salvage from the sunken steamship SS Pacific, a maritime disaster that occurred in 1875. Harrison Harrington had secretly discovered the wreck during a classified deep-water expedition in the early 1990s. Instead of reporting the immense historic find to the government and facing years of brutal litigation, taxes, and maritime legal battles, he had quietly fenced portions of it and buried the rest. He had literally built his corporate shipping empire on a foundation of stolen, untraceable pioneer gold. Madeline staggered back, sitting heavily onto a vintage leather stool near a mahogany drafting table in the corner. The desk was covered in meticulously organized manila folders, ledgers, and a single heavily locked leather briefcase. Her father had left the keys resting directly on top of the leather briefcase. Madeline unlocked the brass catches and opened the lid. Inside lay a mountain of legal documents, bank statements, and another sealed letter addressed to her. She opened the envelope, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The letter detailed the precise truth about Harrington Logistics and the sprawling Fairweather Manor. Her father had not left Preston and Valerie an empire. He had handed them a spectacularly constructed, highly leveraged house of cards, intentionally designed to violently collapse under their immense, arrogant weight. The offshore accounts Valerie inherited were completely frozen by federal investigators due to severe international tax evasion, a trap Harrison had knowingly left unresolved. The shipping conglomerate Preston had swaggered away with was drowning in hundreds of millions of dollars of toxic, hidden corporate debt, secretly mortgaged against the Fairweather Manor itself. Preston and Valerie had inherited nothing but catastrophic liabilities and imminent federal indictments. Madeline, however, had inherited the untethered, untraceable core of the fortune. Over $300 million in physical, liquid assets, completely invisible to the Internal Revenue Service and entirely shielded from any corporate creditors. Madeline stared at the documents, the sheer brilliance and ruthlessness of her father's final act washing over her. He had known his eldest children were vultures, waiting impatiently for his demise so they could strip his bones. So he had fed them poisoned meat and hid the actual treasure in the one place he knew their vanity would never allow them to look, beneath the grease and grime of honest, dirty labor. Madeline spent the next 4 hours documenting everything. She took photographs of the gold, recorded the vehicle identification numbers of the legendary classic cars, and secured the briefcase. She climbed back up the spiral steel staircase, the weight of her new reality settling heavily onto her shoulders. She activated the hydraulic floor plate, watching as the massive slab of painted steel silently hissed back into place, sealing perfectly flush with the stained concrete. She swept a layer of dust and dirt back over the seam, ensuring it was entirely invisible. When she finally stepped out of the carriage house into the cool Connecticut evening, the air tasted different. She locked the heavy wooden doors and walked past the bright orange surveyor stakes Preston had aggressively planted that morning. Over the next 3 weeks, Madeline executed a flawless, surgical operation. She did not drive an expensive car. She did not buy designer clothes. She quietly retained the services of attorney Gregory Belmont, pulling him into the carriage house and revealing the subterranean vault. The veteran lawyer had physically collapsed onto his knees at the sight of the gold, weeping at the sheer historic magnitude of the vehicles. Acting as her completely anonymous intermediary, Belmont contacted an elite network of private Swiss brokers and specialized historians to arrange the highly discreet transfer of the entirely unrecorded physical maritime treasure assets. Belmont managed the massive logistics with ironclad non-disclosure agreements, ensuring that not a single whisper of the massive discovery reached the outside world. Specially trained extraction teams were rapidly hired under the guise of an environmental soil remediation project. They quietly erected large white privacy tents around the entire carriage house, completely blocking the operation from the clear view of the main manor. Heavy lifting machinery was secretly brought in during the dead of night to work. They worked meticulously, reinforcing the subterranean tunnels and carefully preparing the priceless historic vehicles for very safe and fully secure global transport. Every single gold bar and rare pioneer coin was carefully catalogued, securely crated, and comprehensively insured for hundreds of millions of dollars. The operation required absolute perfection, because any minor mistake would certainly alert federal agents to the untraceable fortune. Madeline personally oversaw the packing of the precious metals, running her fingers over the century-old stamps one last time. She felt an overwhelming sense of awe, holding pieces of lost history. Simultaneously, the brilliant legal trap Harrison set for his absolute worst eldest children finally and violently snapped completely shut with absolutely devastating force, destroying their extremely arrogant lives. On the 28th day after the reading of the will, exactly 2 days before Preston issued his strict deadline to evict Madeline from the boundary property line, federal authorities aggressively raided the corporate headquarters of Harrington Logistics. Dozens of armed agents seized every computer, locked every server, and legally froze every single corporate asset. Preston was very publicly escorted from his beautiful glass-walled executive boardroom in cold steel handcuffs, screaming furiously at the gathered local television news cameras. The mighty corporate empire he bragged about possessing was suddenly reduced to a massive mountain of toxic, crushing financial debt. Valerie was unexpectedly detained while eagerly trying to board a luxury private flight to Geneva, Switzerland. Her unlimited platinum credit cards were violently declining at the terminal as the government officially seized the offshore trust funds her brilliant father had entirely abandoned to international auditors. The aggressive federal bankruptcy courts immediately laid direct legal claim to the massive Fairweather Manor estate. Because Preston had foolishly and blindly signed the extensive binding documents, accepting all hidden corporate liabilities alongside the sprawling real estate, the Maine National Bank easily foreclosed on the 50-room family mansion to fully cover the catastrophic debt. Preston was finally released on extremely high bail, only to slowly return to a violently chained and heavily padlocked private estate. He stood helplessly in the freezing winter rain, staring blankly at the bright yellow legal foreclosure notices plastered firmly across his massive wrought-iron gates, visibly shivering in his completely ruined bespoke Italian-tailored suit. Utterly desperate, publicly humiliated, and entirely financially ruined, Preston silently trudged through the thick brown mud, walking directly down the disputed property line toward the only single piece of surrounding land the ruthless National Bank had fully ignored during the aggressive legal corporate seizure. He walked slowly toward the detached eastern carriage house. As he physically approached, he clearly saw Madeline standing very casually beneath the towering, ancient, weeping oak trees. She wore the exact same simple, heavy wool coat, gently holding a freshly steaming hot cup of dark black coffee. Strongly flanked by attorney Gregory Belmont and a massive team of heavily armed private elite security professional contractors. Directly behind her, a massive, long fleet of heavily armored bank transport trucks idled very quietly on the long, wet gravel driveway, all their massive rear steel doors remaining completely unlatched and completely wide open. A specialized heavy lifting crew was currently operating a massive yellow industrial crane, carefully hoisting a massive, thick, heavy canvas tarp-covered object that absolutely perfectly resembled the distinct, beautiful aerodynamic silhouette of a completely priceless, historic, legendary 1955 German Mercedes-Benz, smoothly out through the heavily reinforced old carriage structure lacking any broken wooden roof. Preston abruptly stopped directly at the bright neon orange land surveyor stakes he had previously aggressively pounded deep into the soft, wet ground just several short, bitter weeks prior. The firm legal property boundary line he originally created blocked him completely out. The barrier he built to keep his sister isolated now served as an impenetrable thick wall, keeping him entirely, completely separated from her immense, unbelievable, newfound wealth. Preston heavily choked out, his broken voice cracking loudly with profound sheer desperation and absolute total shock as he blankly stared at the very heavily armed security guards and the idling thick armored transport trucks. He violently sobbed, yelling that the massive family business was now completely, entirely, permanently gone. He cried loudly that their brilliant father had intentionally completely set them up. He wept, stating he had absolutely nothing left to his name. They took the huge manor. They legally took absolutely everything. He desperately begged to know exactly what they were actively pulling out of that utterly pathetic old, rotting, dirty garbage garage right now. Madeline took a very slow, warm sip of her fresh coffee, her calm face remaining completely blank and entirely unreadable. She firmly looked straight at her ruined, visibly shaking older brother, deeply seeing right clearly through the crumbling, shattered, arrogant fake facade that had unfortunately permanently defined his entirely shallow, pathetic, terrible, miserable existence. She smiled very softly, while finally speaking to him with absolute, total confidence, boldly declaring that she was simply throwing away some worthless old rusty garbage car parts. If you were captivated by this incredible, true crime-inspired tale of hidden wealth, family betrayal, and ultimate justice, please smash that like button right now. Share this thrilling story with your friends who love mind-blowing plot twists, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing daily videos. Hit the notification bell so you never miss out on uncovering the most shocking hidden secrets. Leave a comment below telling us what you would have done today.